Pretend that the single grain of salt is $1. Now, if I fill up this teaspoon, this would roughly be about $100,000, which is a decent salary in America today, depending on where you live. Now, let's say that you hit it big and you got a much better job, and this time, you're not earning a teaspoon of dollars, but a tablespoon per year. So this would roughly be about $312,500. So already you're making about more than 98% of Americans. But you see, your goal is to become a millionaire. So you'd actually want to make 3 of these bad boys and about 2/3 of this little guy. And that'll be a perfect recipe to getting $1 million. Now, you've accomplished your goal of achieving $1 million, but let's compare it with $5 million, which would be about a whole cup of salt. According to ChatGPT, many NFL and NBA players, actors, entrepreneurs, influencers, and content creators make this much per year. But let's fill up another cup of salt, and this is how much Whoopi Goldberg makes per year. And I can't help but play this video again because it just gets me every time.
I appreciate that people are having a hard time. Me too. Yeah. I work for a living.
So yeah, even people that make this much compared to this decent American salary per year apparently struggle. Now, we've been looking at income per year, but that's a little different than how much total wealth you own. For example, if you bought a home 5 years ago at $240,000 and because of appreciation, it's now valued at $400,000 and you still owe $170,000 on the mortgage, you've just increased your net worth by $230,000. It's simple math. 400,000 minus 170,000. Now let's look at total wealth in the United States and the distribution of it. Of all of the United States, 1% of the total population owns about 32% of the total wealth. Now let's take an example. Taylor Swift became a billionaire in the last 2 years. So she owns about 13.5 gallons of salt, or roughly 1/3 of a bathtub full of salt, compared to your small little teaspoon. I mean, if you keep working at it, putting a teaspoon of salt in a bathtub to fill it up, how long would it actually take you to fill it up 1/3 of the way? It puts things into perspective a little, doesn't it? But now look at Elon Musk, who owns $360 billion. That's about 107.5 bathtubs of salt. Are you seeing the picture? We'll jump back to this shortly and dive into what this all means and how money actually works. But before we do, I need you to hit that subscribe button if you want to get ahead financially in 2025. Now, let's dive into it. In the beginning, before money existed, people relied on bartering, exchanging goods and services directly. If a person had an axe and wanted wood, they needed to find someone who had wood and wanted an axe. But what if the other person didn't want an axe and actually needed a knife instead? This led to complex chains of trade, making transactions inefficient. To solve this problem, societies introduced a common medium of exchange, something universally accepted. Early civilizations used items like cocoa, seeds, and seashells or cattle as money. Eventually, this evolved into standardized currencies, allowing seamless transactions without the need of direct bartering. In 3000 BC, Mesopotamia used a shekel that was originally a unit of weight used to measure barley or silver and later became the standardized coin. In ancient Egypt, currency was based on the weight of copper and silver, known as the deben. I don't know how to say that. Ancient China used bronze coins and cowrie shells because of the rarity and aesthetic appeal. And you're probably wondering, where did gold currency come from? Well, the earliest civilization that we know of that used gold was the Lydian Kingdom, making the first gold and silver coins in 600 BC. Ancient Rome, India, Greece, and Egypt then used silver coins. The Persian Empire used gold coins, and the Byzantine Empire proceeded to do the same. Now, if you know anything about density, you'd understand that metals get heavy, especially when dealing with gold. If I had a gallon of water, that would roughly weigh about 8 pounds. But if I had a gallon of iron, that would weigh roughly 49 pounds. And if I had a gallon of gold, that would weigh roughly about 160 pounds. So around 1000 AD, the Song dynasty in China decided it was too heavy to carry around all of these metal coins, so it became the first government to issue printed paper money called the JICO. JICO. I don't know how to say that either. So by the 1600s, you had a mixture of all different currencies all across the globe. And the American colonies used a mix of foreign currencies like the Spanish dollar, commodity money like tobacco and beaver pelts, and colonial issued paper money. Each colony had its own currency system. After gaining independence, the United States struggled with the lack of uniform currency. The Continental Congress issued continental currency, but rampant inflation led to its collapse. States issued their own currencies, which then led to chaos. The Coinage Act in 1792 established a U.S. mint and created the first official U.S. coins, including the dollar, which was initially tied to the bimetallic standard of gold and silver. The U.S. continued to use a mix of gold and silver coins, and paper money was issued by both the federal government and the state chartered banks. However, the Panic of 1837 led to bank failures and the eventual establishment of a more centralized system. To finance the Civil War, the U.S. issued greenbacks, paper currency not backed by gold or silver, again leading to inflation. After the war, the U.S. returned to the gold standards in the 1870s to the 1930s. However, this system was disrupted during economic crisis like the Great Depression. The U.S. left the gold standard under President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 to combat the Depression, making the dollar no longer exchangeable for gold. And in 1944, in the aftermath of World War II, 44 countries met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in what we call the Bretton Woods Conference. There they established a new international financial system. The agreement set up the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and also defined the rules for post-war economic cooperation. The key aspect of the Bretton Woods system was that the US dollar became the world's primary reserve currency, and it was backed by gold. The dollar was tied to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other countries agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar, meaning that their exchange rates were directly linked to the value of the US dollar, which in turn was tied to gold. This meant that the US dollar became the standard for international trade and finance all across the globe. Because the US had the largest gold reserves at the time and was the dominant economic power, countries around the world trusted the US dollar and began to use it for trade, foreign exchange, reserves, and international transactions. This effectively made the US dollar the global reserve currency, replacing the British pound, which had previously played a similar role. However, during the 1960s and 70s, the Bretton Woods system faced global inflation, high US trade deficit, and the high cost of the Vietnam War. So in 1971, President Richard Nixon took the US off the gold standard in a move known as the Nixon Shock. This was done because the US was facing a balance of payment crisis, and foreign countries were exchanging their dollars for gold, depleting the US gold reserves. While the dollar was no longer directly backed by gold, it continued to be the world's reserve currency because of the strength and stability of the US economy, the size of the US financial markets, and the role of the US in global trade and politics. Today, the US dollar is still the world's primary reserve currency, and it's still used for most international trade, foreign exchange reserves, and as the standard for pricing commodities like oil. And as long as countries still trust it, it remains as such. But not all countries trust the dollar anymore, and these countries are beginning to increase in number. In 2006 to 2009, Brazil, Russia, India, and China formed a group called BRIC to challenge the dominance of the United States in global finance, politics, and trade. In 2010, South Africa joined the group, and then in 2024, just last year, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates joined at the 16th BRICS Summit in Russia. On top of that, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have been invented to replace the US dollar because of the lack of trust. So we can see some distrust in the dollar increasing globally. But what would cause countries to lose trust in the dollar? This goes back to how the government generally prints money, and they do it in two ways: debt monetization and quantitative easing, which I'll get into quantitative easing a little bit later. Debt monetization, however, is a fancy way of saying that the government turns debt into money. It works like this. The government has a spending problem. The central bank, which controls the money supply, essentially prints money by buying government debt. This creates an illusion of financial stability, money appears out of nowhere, and the debt remains. Hold up, so the government borrows money and the central bank just prints more to cover it? Exactly. Makes total sense. And the US government debt is how much? It's about $36 trillion right now. So let's go back to our salt analogy. Elon Musk owns about 107.5 bathtubs of salt, where you might own only a teaspoon or two. But now multiply Elon Musk's wealth by 100, and that is how much the national government owes. That's why you're seeing a lack of trust in the dollar. So yeah, if we had 100 generous Elon Musks that just gave everything they had, well, then maybe we might be okay. But of course we don't. So how will the US pay it back? That's the real mystery. And that's why Elon Musk and Trump are working so hard to reduce government spending and implement tariffs on imported goods, which drives business back to the United States, whether you agree with their methods or not. But the hard reality is that if we don't do something about it now, it'll come to a head. And what is that head? It's distrust in the dollar, that it's worth anything. And that brings us back to the beginning. To the beginning. Money is simply a currency that you trust is worth something. If everyone values it, then it's worth something. If everyone doesn't, then it's worth nothing. That holds true for everything. For example, during the California gold rush that began in 1848, the discovery of gold spread quickly, and California, which wasn't developed at the time, experienced a high influx of people. When they arrived, they found that there wasn't enough food, which left the miners in desperate situations. So they started to trade their newly discovered gold for food and supplies at a much lower rate than the actual value of the gold that they had mined. Gold nuggets worth $20 to $50 were traded for a bag of flour or a small quantity of meat, and at times the value of food outstripped the value of gold, leading to local merchants and traders to take advantage of the miners' desperate need for sustenance. Even ship captains took advantage by exchanging food arriving by sea for significant amounts of gold. This is important to remember during times when currencies fail, because the survival of you and your family will be determined greatly on whether you have food and water, and that means their value will probably skyrocket. So now let's dive into quantitative easing. Warren Buffett's fortune is built on time and compounding, allowing investments to grow naturally over decades. But what happens when money is artificially injected into the system instead of growing organically? This is called quantitative easing. This is when the central bank buys financial assets such as bonds from institutions like commercial banks, investment banks, and retail banks. The idea is to keep money flowing through the economy, preventing blockages that could slow growth. But there's a catch. Injecting money into the system creates an illusion of economic growth, much like printing money artificially inflates wealth. If too much money is created without real value backing it, inflation kicks in, and inflation erodes wealth over time, meaning your money buys less than it did before. This means the value of the dollar decreases. Now, people tend to react more strongly to bad news than to slow, steady growth. This is why financial crises and recessions dominate headlines while economic recoveries go unnoticed. However, central banks fear one thing above all, and that is economic stagnation. To prevent slowdowns, central banks use two weapons: lowering interest rates and printing money through asset purchases. But here's the problem. If interest rates are already at rock bottom, the only option left is to keep injecting more money, essentially manipulating the system to keep it afloat. Does this strategy work? Well, yes, in the short term, but history shows that excessive money printing often leads to financial crisis. Every manipulated economy eventually faces unintended consequences. Bill Gates was lucky to attend one of the few high schools with a computer in 1968, but luck isn't always positive. Economic luck and risk are two sides of the same coin. One person's financial gain might come at the expense of another. The central bank's interventions create winners and losers. The wealthy who own assets like stocks and real estate benefit from money printing. Meanwhile, the average person sees their savings lose value due to inflation. This is why understanding money printing, compounding, and inflation is crucial to making smart financial decisions. Many people chase wealth to gain financial freedom, but real wealth isn't just about having more money, it's about having control over your time. Understanding how money is created and manipulated can help you make better financial choices so that you don't fall victim to hidden forces at play. So next time you hear about the economy growing, ask yourself, Is it real, or is it just a result of more money being printed? And if you're looking for 7 hacks to gain your wealth, click on this video here and be sure to subscribe for more insights into finance and investing. Thanks so much.